recording now. So welcome to our Disability at Work series. This is the first in 5 sessions that we'll be doing. We'll be kind of walking through working as a neurodivergent. Today we'll be talking about what neurodiversity is. And then the subsequent weeks we'll be talking about job searching and interviewing as neurodivergent, and then looking at resources and a kind of an overview of digital accessibility. If you do have questions throughout today's session, feel free to put them in the chat. We welcome all questions, and we'll make sure we address those as they come up. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our guest speaker, Dr. Dave Caudel from the Frist Center for Autism and Innovation, from Vanderbilt University. We're so excited to have you here today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So folks, I'm Dave Caudel. I'm the Associate Director of the Frist Center for Autism and Innovation at Vanderbilt University. I'm also an autistic adult and self-advocate and physicist. For the past 7 years, my research has primarily focused on autism and neurodivergence in the workplace. And today, the talk I'm giving you guys is just an overview of the strengths and challenges of neurodiversity. So first, let's start with the basics about what is neurodiversity itself. This was a term that was coined in the 90s to push back against the myth that there's such a thing as a normal brain or typical brain. There are diverse ways of thinking. Brain differences are very normal. No two people are exactly alike. So neurodiversity was just to call attention to the fact that each and every one of us as human beings are neurodiverse from one another. In research and for science, we distinguish, in a more technical term, something referred to as neurodivergence, and that is things like ADHD, autism, dyspraxia, dyslexia. If you add them all together, roughly about 1/3 of the US population is neurodivergent. Here's a breakdown of it. About 20% of the population, about 1 in 5 roughly, have some form of dyslexia. About 10% have ADD or ADHD, about 4% dyspraxia, about 2 to 3% have autism like myself. And there are 1% of other types, including Tourette syndrome. And I have no doubt there are some forms of neurodivergence out there that are so rare we probably don't yet have a name for them. So if we look at autism specifically as an example, this is the technical definition of autism, a lifelong developmental disability that typically appears during early childhood and can impact a person's social and communication skills, relationships, and self-regulation. Now, it's important to remember that autism is a spectrum condition, and that means it affects people differently and to varying degrees. For autistic people, a lot of folks in the public tend to think of the autism spectrum in a very linear way. They think at one end of the spectrum, there's everybody who are not autistic. And then at the other extreme end is people who are very autistic. As human beings, we like to think in simplistic terms so we can wrap our heads around unfamiliar concepts. But in a lot of ways, this is not a very accurate way to think about the autism spectrum. In fact, it can be damaging. It's more accurate to think of the autism spectrum as something like this. A wheel of conditions. Now, if you could think that about halfway between the center and the outer edge of the wheel, about half the radius there, you can think of most people as fitting somewhere in the middle of that. And as they get to the origin, close to the center, they're hypo or less than normal. And out to the outer edge, the hyper or more than normal. So if we take sensory sensitivity, for example, most people have a normal sort of sensory sensitivity, the baseline, if you will, for most human beings. Someone who's hyposensitive might be rated like close to the origin in that one little slice. And these are people who, they might be hit by a car and have some bones broken, and the paramedic shows up and the person is calmly talking to them, and the paramedic is impressed at their really high pain tolerance. Wow, they can just Well, that's a sensory processing disorder. Like they're not feeling as much as they should, or some of their feelings are being muted. They're hyposensitive. On the flip side, there are autistic people who have to be very careful about the type of clothing that they wear, or they have to be careful around certain noises and stuff because they're extremely hypersensitive. And a noise that would not bother most people too much might be overwhelming for that person and lead to a sensory meltdown. So if you think of each of these slices as part of the autism spectrum, social skills, motor skills, cognitive function, language skills, executive function, sensory sensitivity. If you were to compare two autistic people that are even on the same part of the spectrum, they might have very different traits. For example, if you tried to restrict yourself to, okay, we're only going to look at autistic adults in their 40s who have a PhD in physics, and get that small subset of people. Now we're in a lot of ways going to be more similar to one another than other parts of the spectrum. And yet still, from individual to individual, autism could express themselves very differently. For me, despite my disabilities, I'm probably I could be considered almost average on the social skills, but that's because I have a lifetime of working to kind of overcome some of the natural challenges and struggles I have in interacting with people whose brains work differently than mine. Motor skills, I'm probably average. Cognitive function, I'm probably above average. Language skills, 40% of autistic adults are non-speaking or minimally speaking. A majority of autistic individuals had some difficulties with verbal communication. I'm what I like to term on the hyperverbal end of the spectrum. Sometimes I use 1,000 words when maybe 6 would have been sufficient, but clearly my language skills are probably above average. My executive function actually varies quite a bit because my sensory sensitivity, this is where I'm an outlier amongst the autism population. I have extreme multivariable sensory issues, much more so than about 99% of ASDs. So it's not as easy to try to wrap your head around if you find out that someone has autism, of figuring out where they are on the spectrum. You certainly shouldn't make any assumptions about what they're capable or not capable of doing or handling. As scientists, it's really hard to categorize such a multivariable spectrum. The best we've kind of come up with so far are these 3 basic levels: ASD level 1, level 2, and level 3. I was diagnosed with Asperger syndrome when I was in my 30s. That's now been sort of grandfathered or wrapped into ASD level 1. When some people think about autism, they're probably thinking about someone who is non-speaking or minimally speaking, severe intellectual disabilities, extreme sensory issues, the kind of folks who are never going to be able to live an independent life. They're going to need assisted living for the rest of their lives. Those people would be ASD level 3. And you notice on all 3 of these levels, ASD level 1 requires some support. ASD level 2 requires substantial support. ASD level 3 requires very substantial support. This is why that linear idea of very autistic and not autistic is not helpful. As an ASD level 1 person, I'm capable of a lot of things. I run a research center as the director. The day-to-day operations of it, I'm involved in dozens of projects. I was able to complete my PhD. Obviously, in a lot of ways, I'm a capable human being, and yet I do still require some supports in order to be able to thrive and be successful in a professional environment. So I found this diagram on the internet some years ago, and for me, it does a perfect encapsulation of, as a society, what we do wrong when we think about neurodivergence, when we think about these differences and stuff. We tend to take a deficits-based view, and that's because in clinics with psychologists and psychiatrists and neurologists, experts who are studying some of the challenges and struggles that we have, those are some of the things that they really sort of like focus on. But when you have a deficit-based view of a particular form of neurodivergence, you don't have a very accurate view of who that person is or what they're capable of. So this is a simple breakdown that kind of shows, dyslexia, they have some difficulty with reading, dyscalculia, difficulty with math, dyspraxia, difficulty with fine motor skills. Now, these are all true about these individuals, but all human beings have strengths and weaknesses. Each and every one of us have some things that we can do as good, if not better, than many people. And some of us have some things that we do, you know, poorly, more poorly compared to most people. It's just a fact of being a human being. Imagine if whatever you struggle with or whatever your challenges were, if there was an official label for that, and everybody used that label for you, and everybody thought of you as the person who's bad at X. Well, that wouldn't feel very good to you, first and foremost. And also, you probably would think, that's not even fair or accurate. I have gifts, I have talents, I have things that I'm good at. It's absolutely true for neurodivergent folks as well. Dyscalculia folks have often demonstrated superior verbal skills and really innovative thinking. Dyslexia is one of my favorites. One of the smartest human beings I've ever met in my life, and I work at Vanderbilt University. I know a lot of physicists, astrophysicists, biologists, chemists, medical doctors. I know some Nobel Prize winners. You know, I've had the pleasure and the honor of having conversations with some really smart and gifted individuals. And it's not an accident that some of the smartest people I've ever met are severely dyslexic. Now, I will admit, the first time I saw someone that had dyslexia and I got to know them, you know, I was impressed by how sharp and intellectual they were. But when I saw them try to write out the word fire, a simple 4-letter word, F-I-E-R, like it kind of broke something in my brain. Like, how could someone so smart not know how to spell a simple 4-letter word? Well, that initial reaction that I had is because I don't have dyslexia, you know? And yet that very same person, one of the things I so much loved about their minds is that if you hit them with a complex problem, they could come up with a brilliant outside the box sort of solution, and the kind of solution that you're like, wow, that is brilliant and that could really work. But if you shut that solution down for whatever reason, he had another solution and another one and another one. It's like his brain was a problem solving supercomputer. It's a buddy of mine from out in rural Tennessee where I grew up. And I like to joke, you know, if the zombie apocalypse happened tomorrow, I'm going to jump in my truck and I'm going to go find Greg and I'm just going to hang out near Greg because I know my probabilities of survival went up an order of magnitude. He's just that brilliant of a problem solver. I know some scientists who have dyslexia who could struggle for a minute or two just to try to read a single sheet of paper. And yet they're very gifted scientists. They're not gifted scientists despite their dyslexia. I would argue in some parts they're gifted science because of their dyslexia. And that's true for all forms of neurodivergence. Every form of neurodivergence that we've looked at, there are some associated gifts and strengths. With autistic individuals such as myself, we're often gifted visual thinkers. We're really good problem solvers. We can we're very good at pattern recognition. We can look at complex patterns. Some of us can look at patterns and pick out a subtle variation of it. And for us, it pops out like a blue dot on a red field, where most people would have to pour through the data for hours to try to figure out what we could figure out as naturally as sort of looking at it. So a good way to think of neurodivergent minds is we have like specialized brains that can perform really, really well in certain regimes in certain areas, almost at the expense of being much worse than a lot of people in other regimes. Thinking about myself, I like to think of, you know, it's from my perspective, your average human being is an incredible generalist. They have a pretty wide and diverse set of range in a lot of regimes and a lot of environments that they can be very adaptable. They're very adaptable socially. It looks like superpowers to me, the way that they can kind of do that. I'm like really, really good at certain regimes, much better so than most people, almost at the expense of being worse than most people in a lot of other regimes. And some of the things that I'm not good at, some people, it's so easy and obvious to them that they can't even wrap their heads around. How could anybody struggle with this? It's so obvious to me. Just like with me with the 4-letter word fire. How could anybody misspell that name? It's so easy and obvious to me. Well, that's because my brain's wired differently than that person. That's the reason why. So this is the reason why the Frist Center exists, and this is the reason why I have a job, is over 80% of autistic adults are unemployed, are underemployed, and that includes people with bachelor's degrees, even graduate degrees. And so the Frist Center, what we're looking at is what does it take for autistic and neurodivergent individuals to find and then thrive in meaningful employment from a strengths-based perspective. That's the crux of our research. This is the guiding star that gets us up every morning. That's what we're working towards. So now I want to give you guys just some basic challenges that neurodivergents face in professional environments like the workplace. For neurodivergent people, especially people on the autism spectrum, misunderstandings and miscommunications can easily arise. When your mind works differently, your language works differently. I could stand shoulder to shoulder with a lot of other people and look at a scenario or look at a situation and have a very different perspective than most people. And in some ways, that means I might miss something that might be obvious to everybody else. But in other ways, that means something might be obvious to me that's not obvious to everybody else. But when you think differently and you process information differently with the wiring in your brain, even language comes out a little bit differently. For those of us on the autism spectrum, we feel like we're the only ones who use language properly because we're very literal thinkers. We use the words in a very concrete, literal sort of way. So when I say something, you don't have to wonder, what did Dave mean when he said that? I'm like, get a dictionary, understand sentence structure, piece it together. That is literally what I meant to say. For us, as you guys know, most people, it's not that uncommon to say something but mean something else, or say something and mean the opposite. Sometimes the language is very vague and hand wavy, and there's a lot of context that's assumed. There's a lot of cultural context, situational context that the speaker is expecting to change the meaning of what they're saying. And if you're wired in the same way, that can be obvious to you, and you can follow along with the conversation, no problem. But for somebody like me, when you say something and you mean something else, I'm very likely to get confused or to misunderstand. And on the flip side, we can appear to be very blunt and direct with our language. And for most people, sometimes being blunt and direct is considered rude, like that person is trying to attack you or that person is angry at you for something. And in reality, we often get misunderstood as that people are assuming that we're being rude or blunt or direct just because we're trying to be jerks. When in reality, we're just trying to communicate. We don't mean anything by it. The worst piece of advice I got as a child when I was growing up is treat other people the way you want to be treated. That is awful, horrible advice to give somebody like me, because I want very blunt, direct communication, two-way. That's the way my brain works. That's the way I can make sure that I don't misunderstand what you're trying to say. And yet that got me into all sorts of trouble. When I was a kid, I used to be told all the time, you are too brutally honest. And those words did not make sense to me. How could honesty be brutal? That did not make sense to me, because if I'm told something, if I'm told a fact, if I don't like the fact or the fact makes me unhappy, yeah, there are facts out there, but I don't immediately ascribe anger or resentment towards the person who spoke, especially if the fact is true. I don't hold people at fault for that sort of thing. So it was hard for me to wrap my head around why people were holding me at fault when I was sharing things that they didn't want to hear. So misunderstandings can easily happen back and forth. And another challenge that we can face is for autistic people in particular, we can be very detail oriented. It's how our brains are wired. Most humans are able to think in pretty broad terms and look at pretty wide scales of things and look at take a sort of holistic approach when they're thinking about a concept or something like that. We tend to get much more lost in the details, the minutia of that. We feel like we have to really understand all those little pieces to be able to understand the concept. But sometimes we can get caught up in that, and we can end up wasting a lot of time when in reality, we should have asked for help. That sort of thing has happened. It's been a challenge of mine my whole life. If you have an autistic employee or a coworker, a very common example that I hear from the IT field is that they'll have an autistic coder. They'll ask him to design a tool for the client. He spends about 2 or 3 hours designing that tool. The tool works with about 90% efficiency. shows that to his bosses, they show that to the client, everybody's happy with the tool. They want to use the tool and move on. But this person is so detail-oriented focus is that they can't help but see all the little ways that maybe it could be improved a little bit. And they want to insist on spending another 20 hours working on it to get that 90% up to like maybe a 94 or 95%. They're willing to spend another 20 hours. And they're quite resistant to not doing that and moving on to the next project. In those instances, they need a boss that kind of understands autism and says, look, I understand you want to make it perfect and you have a strong need to get in there and mess around with the details, but we can't really afford about another 20 hours of your work effort on this one project. This project has been done to the client's satisfaction, it's been done to our satisfaction. I know it's not easy for you, but you got to let it go and you got to move on to the next thing. Sometimes we need a little help like that to help us break out of that minutia obsessive interest. So how should we all address these sorts of challenges in the workplace? And I would say first and foremost, if you have a coworker or a colleague or someone that you know is in some way, shape, or form neurodivergent, if they've expressed that or disclosed that, it doesn't hurt to go out and do a little basic research just to kind of become familiar with the type of the neurodivergence. It's really important that you don't just focus on the negative. I mean, it's kind of nice to know what sorts of challenges someone might face, so then you can have conversations about accommodation and inclusion. But don't consider that to be all there is to that person. There's almost certainly some gifts, some unique contributions, some unique viewpoints that person can bring that you should be mindful of. A big important factor to remember is the best way to communicate with someone who is neurodivergent, and this is true for anybody whose brain might be wired differently than yours, is to be careful and clear with your language. Try to stick to saying what you mean. If the other speaker is coming across as blunt, please try to be understanding that they're probably not trying to be blunt. Obvious things to you may not be obvious to them, so try not to make assumptions. When you hear somebody says something and your brain immediately goes, oh my God, they're missing the obvious. How on earth could they miss the obvious? Like, take a breath and think, oh, because they might be wired differently. It's obvious to me, it might not be obvious to them. Try to give people some grace and the benefit of the doubt and try to engage them in that way. Those are the sorts of environments that people like me absolutely thrive in. Because when you give me the benefit of the doubt, you'll see that underneath it, I want to be a good human being too. I want to treat you with respect. I might have difficulty or some misunderstandings of what exactly that entails, but I mean well, and I'm trying to engage you in a sincere and honest way. And once we're both speaking a common language to where we can understand each other, like 90% of the problems and conflicts kind of sort themselves out, because now we're both talking to each other and we're understanding each other. It is also important to remember that when a misunderstanding does occur, it's important to tackle it with an open and honest conversation. Try to clarify what each person meant, share with them feedback if they said something that was inappropriate. Look, there's a lot of soft skills when it comes to socialization, and there are a lot of unwritten rules in any particular workplace culture or professional culture and stuff. And from my perspective, most human beings have this amazing superpower to just go into a new unfamiliar place and just yada yada their way into understanding how the culture works, what can be said and what cannot be said, how a conversation should go. Like, they're just very adaptable to that sort of things. We can miss a lot of that stuff. Sometimes we need a little bit of hand holding. We need someone to explain to us, hey, what you said just now, that's just never acceptable in a professional environment. Add that to your list of things you should never talk about. Or maybe like what you said wasn't so bad, but how you said it was really offensive. Let me coach you perhaps on some lighter, more, professional or less abrasive ways of saying the same sort of thing. I'm as sociable, I'm able to adapt as well as I am in professional social situations, because in my past, I had a lot of kind-hearted souls that pulled me aside and explained to me some of the do's and don'ts. Now, the do's and don'ts did not make sense to me. Obviously, if I knew it would be offensive or if I knew it would have been upsetting, I wouldn't have said it or I wouldn't have done it that way. So clearly I had some blinders to that. But it's important for us we want people to be accommodating and accepting of us. And it's also important that we try to be accommodating and accepting of other people. And so we can meet somewhere in the middle and support and help each other and resolve most of those issues. So the Frist Center for Autism and Innovation is in Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. We've been operating for nearly 7 years now. We work with pretty much every stakeholder in this. We work with companies, corporations, and businesses. These are in the early days, there were companies that had a proven track record of hiring and retaining autistic or neurodivergent talent. And our work with them was basically, what is your secret sauce? What are you doing differently than everybody else? Why did this 43-year-old with a master's degree who had never held down full-time employment, how was he able to be hired by your company working full-time? And now he's 8 or 9 years into his career. What were you doing different that worked for this person that they were missing from before? But these days, more and more, we're working with companies and businesses that are looking to hire neurodivergent talent, or they're looking to better serve the neurodivergent members of their workplace communities and stuff. So we do obviously a lot of work with in that regime. We also work with nonprofits that serve the autistic and neurodivergent populations, high schools, colleges, academia, state and local governments, pretty much all of the stakeholders who are involved in the community of these issues of unemployment or underemployment. We're always happy to chat with people. So I say anyone who has a question related to autism or neurodivergence, anything that might have an impact on the workplace, they're welcome to reach out to us. I can and do talk to people like that all the time. We're happy to point people towards resources. I'm working very hard to try to make the Frist Center for Autism and Innovation sort of like a nexus point for these sorts of issues. And in other words, I don't have all the answers, but if you have a question and I don't have the answer, chances are really good that I know some people who do, and I would be happy to connect you with them. And so I'll just end my talk right here, and we will open it up to questions. And I see that there's some things in the chat room, so give me just a second.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I know some people were asking